do not let them attempt to shift the blame. Why must we release prisoners early? Because the Tories served themselves. Why is crime routinely unpunished? Because for 14 years, the Tories performed the politics of easy answers rather than use the power of government to serve our country.
He's the former Director of Public Prosecutions, but now he's Prime Minister. Can Keir Starmer get Britain's prisons back under control? Speaking at Labour's conference, it was very clear who he thinks is to blame for the crisis. One of his party's first actions in power was to order the early release of thousands of inmates. It's something that will temporarily reduce numbers, tackle overcrowding, and allow for more serious offenders to be put behind bars.
Well, those challenges are still here, Conference, and we are facing up to them. But do not forget what they did, and do not let them attempt to shift the blame, because the state of our country is on them. Why must we release prisoners early? Because the Tories served themselves. Why are our public services on their knees? Because the Tories served themselves. Why is crime routinely unpunished? Our rivers polluted, borders insecure, school roofs crumbling, child poverty rampant. Nothing seems to work. Our public finances broken. Because for 14 years, the Tories performed the politics of easy answers rather than use the power of government to serve our country.
While the Prime Minister says it was the only course of action available to him, domestic violence charities and probation officers have both raised the alarm about how it's been implemented.
We know that not all domestic abuse perpetrators will have been exempt from the scheme, so some will slip through the nets, as it were, and will be released early. And this is a really worrying time for survivors of domestic abuse.
Our members would do their level best to ensure that public safety is paramount in processing an early release, but I can't stand here and say it's not without risk. So one of the problems is that we weren't widely consulted or appropriately consulted on the mechanics of the scheme.
To understand the impact of this decision to release prisoners early, I'm back in the studio, and I'm delighted to say I'm joined by a former Lord Chancellor, Justice Secretary and Minister for Prisons, Sir Robert Buckland. Sir Robert, welcome to Westminster Watch.
Thanks, Nick.
You described when the early release programme was announced by the Prime Minister Keir Starmer that it was essentially a sticking plaster solution, but didn't the Conservative government leave Labour with little choice?
Well, you know, nothing's new under the sun, and the previous Labour government had a similar crisis where it was releasing prisoners back in 2009 and using police cells. What we strove to do, and what I strove to do in office, was to try and build new prisons, and we started the biggest prison building programme since the Victorians. I think what happened was two things. One, there were planning issues with some of the new prisons that were delaying things. And two, as a result of COVID, the remand population, that is people awaiting trial and sentence, shot up by about a fifth and has never come down since. And you know, that number's about 6,000 or 7,000 people. That would have made the difference, I think, had that been brought down between having a sustainable prison space policy and then Labour's decision to release prisoners.
So there was a plan to build new prisons, and COVID came along and effectively disrupted the supply of prisoners, if you like, in terms of remand prisoners. But explain this to me, as a former Justice Secretary, sat round the Cabinet table. We both know that the early release scheme is a short-term measure. What can a Justice Secretary, what can a Prime Minister actually do to fix the problem?
With a willpower, there's a lot you can do, and I've solved some of the problem. There was big public concern about the early release of serious sexual and violent offenders at halfway mark. I changed that to make sure that people after over 4 years in terms of their sentence stayed in for 2/3 of their time, which is what it used to be before Labour changed it 20 years ago. Now, the other bit I wanted to do was to really use technology and ramp up up technology through tagging and curfew requirements to avoid having to use prison cells for sentences of a few weeks in duration. Far better, in my view, to keep that type of offender, often an offender who perhaps had a drug addiction or was shoplifting, that type of acquisitive crime, in the community, being intensively supervised and in effect under house arrest. Now that seemed to me to be a better use of resources, freeing up those prison places for the more serious and dangerous offenders. I think there was a reluctance in number 10 to acknowledge that rather than using that as a way of beefing up community sentences, we needed to use technology as a direct alternative to sending people to jail. And that's where I think the policy faltered. It was in a white paper, a policy document that I published as Lord Chancellor, and had I stayed in office, I would have continued to push for the more intelligent use of prison as a place to protect the public.
Just the logic follow that with a former Director of Public Prosecutions, now a Prime Minister, that we have any reason to be hopeful he will be able to get a grip of this problem because he will understand it better.
Well, he understands it, and James Timpson, the Prisons Minister, is somebody who understands the issue as well. But you know, Nick, the problem will always be the Treasury and the priorities of spending on public services. It's always health and schools and education and other visible public services that tend to take precedence over the hidden services like prisons, probation and the courts.
People won't understand that, though. Forgive me, Sir Rob. People won't understand that. The Prime Minister, amongst other things, is First Lord of the Treasury. Why should the Treasury determine what are the priorities of a Prime Minister? Why is it that this Prime Minister has come to office and within his first weeks he said, I've inherited a crisis, fairly or not, from the Conservatives on prisons, and yet some bean counter in the Treasury can tell him not to do it. Why is that? Is that lack of political will?
Well, look, I think the Treasury has immense power within this is our system of government. I mean, arguably, you do need a Treasury and an organisation like that to have power because this is public spending. But I think what has happened is that in the religion of priorities, if you like, and the power that the visible public services have, justice has not been resourced in the way that I think it should have been over many, many years. And we're going right back deep into the last Labour government.
Do you think one of the biggest statistics that people constantly talk about is the high reoffending rate amongst all adults, around 50%, and those younger adults, around 58% of those who are on shorter sentences. Do you think one of your biggest failings is that you never were able to crack reducing reoffending rates?
Well, actually, the overall reoffending rate did reduce from 31% to 26% during the Conservatives' term in office. That is a success, mainly because I think we were locking up really bad and dangerous offenders, and that was the right thing to do. You are correct to focus upon the failure of reoffending rates in short-term sentences, which is why I think we need to take a new approach. And I very much hope that the new sentencing review... I think as we did with young people, we had an intensive supervision approach to their lives immediately after they were sentenced. We need to do the same with some of these adults who frankly live chaotic, disorganised lives, who are very often in the grip of an addiction, who have never really got a grip on what it is to be a responsible adult, who resort to crime as an easy fix, but frankly who need the supervision from the probation service and suitably qualified people in order to get their lives sorted and turn things around so that we're not plagued by more offending and there are fewer victims of crime.
With more offenders now free from jails early, are we less safe than we were before the general election?
Well, I think there are going to be some cases where there will be reoffending, and I very much hope that the new ministers in charge are taking a very careful look at who they're releasing. I thought that to release 1,700 people in one day was rather risky, and so it has proved. Surely it would have been better to phase those releases out and to make sure that everything that should have been done could have been done in terms of support, monitoring and accommodation. Already we've had a few mistakes made, people being released in error because of a misinterpretation of the law. Again, I think all these, with respect, are avoidable errors. And certainly during COVID, when I had the task of having to release some prisoners who might have been more vulnerable to the virus than others, we were very careful in the hundreds of releases that we made not to expose the public to risk. And I'm glad to say that nothing untoward happened. Now, that was a smaller scale scheme, but the principle remains a good one, that as ministers we have a responsibility to protect the public.
Do you, in the unlikely, hopefully, event that there is a serious reoffending case, do you share the responsibility with present ministers if something goes wrong, or do you think this will firmly be on Labour?
Well, they made a decision to execute this at great speed, so the responsibility lies with them. When I was in office for just over 2 years, I did everything I could to increase funding, and we increased both capital funding and revenue funding for prisons, probation and indeed the court service too. Now, a lot more needed to have been done, and I wish, Nick, that I'd had the more time and space to do it, because I'll say this, I think a Lord Chancellor and a Justice Secretary needs to be in office for 4 years minimum to really make a difference. And you need people in there who know the system, who know its weaknesses, and who can get things done. And my big regret is that I wasn't allowed to do more, bearing in mind all the changes that I made to the law and all the reforms I made during my time in office.
Sir Robert Buckland, former Chancellor, former Justice Secretary and former Minister for Prisons, thanks for joining us here on Westminster Watch.
Thanks, Nick.
The Prime Minister may point the finger at the Tories, but this is something that's been happening for a long time. This graph shows just how much the prison population has grown over the past 100 years. Even accounting for population growth, the UK is incarcerating more than double the number of people than a century ago. And that doesn't seem to be enough to satisfy the public. According to a YouGov poll, 62% of people thought the sentences handed down by courts were not harsh enough, compared with just 3% of people who thought they were too harsh. The obvious answer would be to build more prisons, and that is the plan. However, a $5.3 billion plan to create 20,000 extra places has been delayed and won't be complete until 2030 at the earliest. Joining me now to discuss whether prison really is the answer are Steve Gillan, the General Secretary of the Prison Officers Association, Wendy Joseph, a former judge at the Old Bailey, and Sian Williams, CEO of the prisoner resettlement charity Switchback. Welcome to you all. Thanks for joining us here on Westminster Watch. Wendy, if I may come to you, you will have sent to jail some serious hardened criminals. What is prison there for, and does it work?
Two separate questions, and what it's there for depends upon what we as a society want from it. We say that the purpose of sentencing is punishment, deterrence and rehabilitation. Well, two things are very clear. Prison is not doing much by way of deterrence, and it's doing almost nothing by way of rehabilitation. Whether it punishes, well, the longer you lock people up for, I suppose, the more you punish them. And of course it's true that as long as people are locked up, they're not out in society committing crimes. But Nick, they don't stay there forever. And when you open the door and let them out, if you haven't rehabilitated them, then you've got a problem.
Is the bigger problem with reoffending we're applying to when people are sentenced for short sentences, that they then seem to be reoffending at extremely high rates of anywhere between 50 and 58%. So should we, in your experience, sitting on the bench, should we be sending as many people to jail for short sentences as we're doing now?
Well, you can't really make the comparison between short and long sentences, because if you send someone to prison for life with a minimum of 25 years, which is what very often happens, for example, with a murderer, they're not going to be troubling anyone for 25 years, except within the prison estate itself. The very fact that we give short sentences that do not deter and do not rehabilitate is, well, it's a shame upon our society.
Sian, you do work at Switchback, actually doing your best to help people stay away from reoffending, stay away from jail. I hope I've paraphrased that correctly. You've had some extraordinary success. The national rate is actually 1 in 5 reoffending. When you've been involved, it's 1 in 10. Why is that, and why can't we roll that out elsewhere?
Well, we can roll it out elsewhere, and that, I think, is the big question, is why aren't we doing that? So the difference that we make is, I think, 2 key things. The first is that we put someone alongside a young guy leaving prison, and we put alongside a mentor. They're normally a trained caseworker, and they start working with the person in prison, really thinking about what's it going to be like this time when you're released? Where are you going to live? How are you going to feed yourself? And at heart, who are you, and what positive contribution could you make to this society, and what do you need to get there? When they're released, we really help them get housing, access to benefits, thinking about training, employment, and then really crucial things like mental health support, and sometimes support to rebuild relationships with family and friends, because we can't thrive in society if we're on our own. The challenge is that the system doesn't really work that way. So Switchback comes alongside and says to in our case, we work with young men, all the different things that you need to do, all the puzzles that you have to solve to really get success in resettlement. It's very hard to do it on your own when you're on tag, which means that you have to be, back in your digs at a certain time. If your housing is insecure, if you're kicked out after 6 weeks, because that's what you're entitled to, if you've got no money to feed yourself. So having someone who can help you solve all those problems so that you don't end up being recalled back to prison because you haven't got somewhere to live, or you ended up shoplifting.
And this is, of course, better for society as well as the individual. But Steve, when someone is sent to prison, they are quickly out of sight and out of mind of the rest of the justice system and the public as well. However, is it safe these days inside our prisons? What chance have we of hoping someone will not reoffend if they are going into what is an unsafe environment in prisons? Indeed, is it safe even for your own officers who you represent?
Well, there's a couple of issues there, but I'd like to comment on both my colleagues Wendy and Sian, because they've made some very important interjections there about what prisons should be for and the hope at the end of when someone is eventually released, because let's face it, 98% of prisoners are someday going to be released. It's only a tiny minority that get that whole life tariff. Prisons aren't safe, Nick. They're not safe for my members. The official stats will tell you that. My members are assaulted every single day of the week. It's dramatically increased, and some of them have been coming home with life-changing injuries to the families. But I actually think what we need, you opened up, Nick, by saying that the Prime Minister blamed the Tories for what they inherited. And that's the problem with our public services. You get the Conservatives blaming Labour, you get Labour blaming the Conservatives, and nothing ever gets done. And that's very real about prisons, because prisons are out of mind. If you speak to the general public, the public will first and foremost see firsthand what a nurse does, what a doctor does, what a police officer does, what a firefighter does, what a teacher does. They don't actually see what a prison officer does. But it's a very important public service that is out of sight, out of mind. And the problem that we've got, and that's why my union has been calling for a royal commission, not just into prisons, but into the whole criminal justice system. Because it's creaking at the seams, it's broken, and you will know that.
But Wendy, does that mean, if the system is broken, as Steve has outlined, that actually prison is no longer a realistic alternative? And is the answer to build more prisons?
Well, a realistic alternative to what? Yes, we can keep building more prisons, but the reality is there is a limited pot of money. So if you put it into building prisons, you're not using it to build hospitals. You're not using it to look after the elderly in society. You're not using it for mental health issues, which might actually help all the other problems. So you've got to make decisions. Society, those we elect to look after us, have to make decisions.
But that's a problem, isn't it? Because I think, Steve, you were alluding to this. The public want people to go to prison, don't they? It's simple as that.
I actually think what we do need in this country is an adult conversation. And when you get political parties trying to outmaneuver each other about who can be toughest on crime. So for example, you had Michael Howard era where he says prison works. And then you had Tony Blair saying tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime. And the prison population went from 43,000 right up to 87,000 today. The reality is, Wendy's spot on about you can't build your way out of a crisis. In the last 14 years, we've seen 20-odd prisons close. And we've not seen the numbers
the new ones
increase.
haven't opened. And we had Robert Buckland on earlier, former Chancellor, explaining why they hadn't opened.
Well, he actually speaks a lot of sense, Robert Buckland, and I've got to say I met Robert Buckland on numerous occasions, along with Alex Chalk as well, his successor. Both knew how difficult the system was. Both knew that short-term sentencing didn't really work. Both knew that there was far too many people in prison. But the problem is, we've got to take the British public with us, because you gave out the stats there, and we've got to make sure that people understand sentencing policy, because actual fact, sentencing policy is very convoluted.
Steve, let me ask Sian, the converse of that is, given it costs approximately £48,000 a year to keep someone in prison, doesn't actually the opportunity to say to the public, Sian here has reduced the number of people who are going back into prison, and if it's 5 out of 10 she's reduced going back, that's £200,000. The economics meet the, if you like, more liberal agenda of reform. I mean, how much does it cost you to invest time so that someone doesn't go back to prison?
Yeah, I mean, our figures change all the time, but we're looking at around £8,000 to support someone.
That's a bargain.
It's an absolute bargain. And I think if we ask people the question, if someone has committed a crime, should they go to prison? Most people will say yes. But if you ask people a different question, what do you really want? What they want is less crime. And you don't get less crime by locking people up, failing to rehabilitate, and then releasing them homeless with no opportunity to feed themselves or make a positive contribution. So you're absolutely right. There is an opportunity here for an adult conversation, which I think we are all in agreement of, which is, in 10 years' time, in 20 years' time, what kind of society do we want to be? Do we want to be a society that locks people up, forgets about them, and then really just gets angry at them for failing to change when we've done nothing to help and really taken away any support? Or do we want to start investing in people while they're in prison, helping them build a different life? That's the Switchback model. And really making sure that everyone who leaves prison has a safe place to sleep that night, money in their pocket to be able to feed themselves so they don't have to go and shoplift or turn back to old friends and family who might take them back into crime, and make sure they've got a long-term plan.
One area we're not touching on so far has been, well, let me put it this way to you, Wendy. Have you seen people come before you during your whole career, whether as a barrister or as a judge, who actually you think, we could have stopped them ending up in the criminal justice system in the first place?
Oh, Nick, thousands.
And what are we doing wrong then?
We're trying to sort the problem out far too late in the day. You know, I used to have little kids come to the Old Bailey after court to see the building and to understand the system. At the ages of 6, 7 and 8, they totally got that you shouldn't hurt other people because they didn't like being hurt themselves, and they understood the quid pro quo. By the time they were 16, 17 and 18, they had a completely different mindset. We, our society, lose them somewhere in that decade. None of those kids should end up in my or any courtroom.
Steve and Sian, I'll come to you both very quickly, if I may. Steve, do your prison officers see people who they know should not be in prison? And what proportion of those in prison do you think shouldn't be there?
Prison officers up and down the country would tell you exactly what I'm going to say now, because I was a serving prison officer. And I used to see people all the time that probably should have been diverted away from prison, that were mentally ill, that should have been nowhere near it. I worked in a female establishment where some of those individuals should have been nowhere near a prison because they'd been abused and different things. But I think we have forgotten about one caveat here. The victim of crime should always come first, in my view, and that's why you've got to convince the British public that there are alternatives to prison and we can't build away out of a crisis. But I would say there's probably at least 20% of people that maybe could have easily been diverted away from prison in the first place.
If you had one thing that could be delivered today to help reduce reoffending in your experience, what would your ask be?
That every single person leaving prison has a safe place to sleep, and that accommodation is guaranteed for the next 6 months.
Thank you all for joining me here on Westminster Watch here today. I'm sure we'll be coming back to this discussion because I have a feeling it's not going away. Indeed, thanks again to all my guests for joining me. And don't forget to subscribe to the TRT World YouTube channel for more lively debate and conversation. But for now, from me and all the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.